Thunder woke me before the sun did. Not the soft kind either, not the kind that rolls across the valley and fades, but the kind that sounds like something is breaking on purpose. Then came the crack of branches, the pounding of hooves, and that wet, sour smell of manure pushing through my screen door so fast it felt like somebody had slapped me awake. I stumbled to the window barefoot, heart hammering, and there they were. Black and white Holsteins, 100 of them flooding through my orchard like somebody had decided my grandfather's life's work would make a fine place to pasture cattle before breakfast. They were crushing rose bushes he planted by hand in 1962, tearing through drip lines, snapping young limbs, churning 11 years of careful soil work into a slick brown mess. 6 mature Honeycrisp trees were already down, just flat in the mud, like bodies after a fight. And out by the road, parked in a spotless white SUV, like she was there for a parade instead of a crime scene, stood Renata Holloway, president of the Ridgemont Estates HOA Arms, folded, watching the whole thing with that little smug smile people wear when they think they finally got away with something. Then she gave me a tiny wave, just a quick flick of the fingers like this was neighborly. That wave told me more than any lawsuit ever could. It told me she thought I was beaten. My name's Cord Beaumont, and I own an orchard in the Shenandoah Valley that was supposed to be the one good inheritance a man could pass down without lawyers getting involved. My grandfather Elmer planted the first trees because that's what men like him did. They didn't sit around talking legacy. They just put roots in the ground and trusted somebody decent would come after them. When he died in 2009, he left me 7 acres of apples and pears, a tired old cider barn from 1971, and enough deferred maintenance to make any sane person sell the whole thing and move on. I was an HVAC tech with a bad back, no real farming experience, and a daughter named Waverly who loved that orchard like it was stitched into her bloodstream. So I stayed. I learned the hard way, same as most worthwhile things. Frozen mornings with pruning shears stiff in my hands, summer afternoons fixing irrigation in heat thick enough to drink farmers' markets, pick your own weekends, cider tanks humming in the barn while the sweet yeasty smell hung in the air. Waverly grew up in those rows. By 12, she could explain the difference between a wine sap and a Honeycrisp better than most grown men pretending they knew fruit. By 14, she was handling the entrance table on weekends, muddy to the knees, hair tied back, collecting waiver forms and stacking cash that was supposed to help fund college one day. That orchard wasn't scenery. It was our plan. Then Renata Holloway moved into Ridgemont Estates and decided she was the kind of woman who ought to manage other people's lives. Retired pharmaceutical sales, polished, relentless, one of those people who says, community standards with the same warmth most people reserve for dental surgery. She ran for HOA president, promising to protect property values, which in practice meant finding whatever around her couldn't be controlled and trying to control it anyway. She offered to buy me out twice. The first offer came with fake politeness. The second came with a tone that suggested refusal itself was rude. I said no, both times. That was the beginning. The certified letter showed up in February. Cold morning, rubber banded to my mailbox, HOA seal stamped across the front like they were delivering a federal indictment instead of nonsense. According to Renata, my cider barn, built 28 years before her HOA even existed, was a non-conforming commercial structure. $500 a week in fines until I tore it down or brought it into compliance. I made calls, left messages, got nothing back. So I did what a reasonable man does when he still believes reason matters. I went to the HOA meeting with a folder full of records and legal citations, figuring facts might do the trick. Before I left, Waverly looked up from the kitchen table and asked, "You're bringing the folder, right?" I told her I always brought the folder. She looked at me the way only a teenager can, like I was technically functional but not especially bright. What I brought besides the folder was my phone with the recorder running. I'd been up half the night reading Virginia law and learned the state was one-party consent. Didn't seem like much at the time. It turned out to be one of the best decisions I made that year. The community room at Ridgemont smelled like stale coffee, cheap perfume, and anticipation. Those meetings usually drew a dozen people, maybe. That night there were 43, every folding chair filled, and I knew before anyone spoke that I'd walked into something staged. Renata sat at the front in a blazer the color of authority, smiling like she was about to moderate a panel instead of orchestrate a hit. I laid out my case anyway. The barn predated the HOA. The orchard qualified under Virginia's right to farm protections. The fines had no legal basis. I was calm, specific, polite. Then a man in a good suit stood from the back row and introduced himself as the HOA attorney. That's when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an ambush. He had one narrow argument ready, one technical thread about whether a temporary lease arrangement during the late 90s might affect continuous agricultural use at the moment the HOA was formed. It wasn't a knockout point, but it was enough to muddy the water in front of a room full of people who didn't know the law and weren't there to learn it. Every time I tried to answer, Renata cut me off using Robert's rules like she'd studied them the way some people study scripture. Out of order, not germane. The chair recognizes. It was theater, and she'd sold tickets. So I asked one question before I sat down. I asked whether my orchard parcel was actually inside the HOA boundary on the county's original recorded plat, not the HOA documents the county's. Silence. Renata dodged it, moved on. Meeting adjourned. Out in the parking lot, cold wind coming off the Blue Ridge gravel, crunching under my boots, an older man stopped me before I got to my truck. Quiet voice, steady eyes, the kind of face that doesn't waste words. He told me his name was Fletcher Oakes. Said he'd been on the original survey crew back in 1998. Then he said something that changed the whole shape of my life. Your orchard was never supposed to be in that plat, he told me. Somebody put it there after I drew the line. That was the twist. The moment the whole story stopped being about petty HOA harassment and became something uglier. Somebody hadn't just tried to bully me. Somebody years earlier had moved a legal boundary they had no right to touch and built an entire fake authority on top of it. The next morning, I pulled the original survey from the county recorder's office, spread that oversized blueprint across a table, and there it was, clean as daylight. Fletcher's line, my orchard outside it, not close, not debatable, outside. I sent photos to a real estate attorney named Davia Merritt, a woman recommended to me with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for trauma surgeons and old-school mechanics. She called me back fast, studied the documents, and told me not to pay a dime. Renata didn't know we'd found the crack in the foundation yet, so she kept pressing. 3 zoning complaints landed the same morning. Retail violations, stormwater issue, unlicensed food processing. It was the bureaucratic version of throwing sand in somebody's eyes and hoping they fall down before they can swing. Davia crushed them one by one. The retail complaint died under Virginia agritourism law. The stormwater complaint was grandfathered out of existence. The cider permit was the only thing even slightly gray, so I cleaned that up immediately and took away the target. That's when Davia started digging deeper. A week later, she called and told me what she'd found. My parcel had been inserted into the HOA boundary between the original survey and the formal filing. No amendment process, no consent from my grandfather, nothing legal at all. In plain English, I had likely never belonged to Ridgemont Estates in the first place. Ever. Then Renata panicked, though I didn't know it yet. A quiet stretch followed the dangerous kind, the kind where a person like that doesn't retreat. She reloads. Then came that April morning, 5:47 a.m., thunder hooves, manure, broken trees, her little wave. But this time I didn't freeze for long. I called 911. I called Davia's emergency line. Then I turned on every exterior camera on the property. I'd installed 12 cloud-backed cameras after the HOA meeting just in case. Not because I was paranoid, because something in me had started to understand that decent people get in trouble when they keep assuming everybody else is decent too. The deputies arrived fast, walked the orchard with me, photographed the damage, took statements. When I showed them the footage, cattle being deliberately driven through my fence line by men on ATVs, not wandering in by accident, the mood changed. One deputy looked at the 6 destroyed Honey Crisps lying in the mud and muttered, "This is messed up." That wasn't official language, but it meant more to me than polished sympathy ever could. Then the second twist hit. Around 9:30 that morning, one of Gus Braddock's hired hands pulled into my drive, looking sick with conscience. Young guy, maybe 25, dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking just enough to notice. He held out his phone and showed me a text thread with Renata's name at the top. I read the message once, then again, just to feel how cold it was. Make sure they get into the main rows. I want him to see what happens when you fight us. She had put it in writing. There are moments in life when anger burns so clean it turns into focus. That was one of them. I photographed every message, sent them to Davia, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and wrote a plan instead of a rant. That's something I learned somewhere between broken compressors and broken people. Panic feels active, but it doesn't build anything. A plan does. What Davia built over the next few weeks was beautiful in a way only law can be when it finally lands on the side of truth. She filed for declaratory judgment that my orchard was never lawfully inside the HOA. She added claims for trespass, agricultural vandalism, tortious interference, defamation, and attorney's fees. Then she found the detail that made Renata's whole little empire start shaking. For 20 years, the HOA had been calculating part of its reserve fund using my parcel, a parcel it had no legal authority to include. That meant money had been accumulated year after year on a fiction. Davia moved to freeze the reserve fund during litigation and seek disgorgement of the portion built off that illegal inclusion. When that fund got frozen, the neighbors who'd once clapped for Renata started doing math. Suddenly, the pool roof repair was delayed. Maintenance slipped. Monthly dues were now effectively feeding a war most homeowners never wanted. The same woman who'd packed a room against me was now bleeding the neighborhood to defend a lie. Board members started peeling away. A few quiet neighbors began feeding me information. One anonymous note showed up in my mailbox that simply said, "I've been afraid to say anything for 2 years. You're not alone." I taped it on the barn wall beside an old photo of Elmer planting the first row. By the time trial came around, the room was full. Fletcher took the stand first and walked the judge through that original survey like a man reading scripture carved in stone. Then Davia read Renata's cattle texts into the record. Slowly, evenly, each word dropping into the courtroom like a nail in a coffin. Renata didn't move. Her new attorney, some poor soul who looked like he usually handled DUIs and bad weekends, objected where he could and lost where it mattered. Then the paper trail came in. Internal records showing my parcel had been added without authorization, without amendment, without consent, without legal basis. Not one day in 23 years had that HOA ever had lawful power over my orchard. Judge Presswood ruled from the bench. My parcel was not and never had been part of Ridgemont Estates HOA. Every fine, demand, and so-called restriction they'd ever tried to put on me was void from the beginning, legally dead as if it had never existed. A month later, at the damages hearing, he awarded the whole thing. Actual damages for the destroyed trees and irrigation, consequential damages for lost harvest, attorney's fees, and the disgorgement tied to that reserve fund. $175,200 coming out of the same HOA reserve fund Renata had counted on as her war chest. That was the part that really landed. Not because I'm greedy, not because revenge tastes better with commas in the check amount, but because she had built her confidence on the idea that systems protect the people who know how to manipulate them. She thought paperwork was a weapon only people like her could use. Turns out paperwork cuts both ways. She resigned before the recall vote finished. Criminal charges ended in a plea deal, probation, restitution. No grand jailhouse drama, just permanent consequences that followed her around like a bad smell. Gus Braddock got probation too. A new board took over. Dolph Maines, a contractor who'd finally grown tired of the circus, became HOA president unopposed. I replaced the 6 destroyed Honey Crisps and planted 4 more on the south side where the light runs better. Waverly helped me sink every one of them into the earth. Later, I used part of the damages award to start the Elmer Beaumont Agricultural Scholarship at Blue Ridge Community College, $2,500 a year for a student going into ag science or land stewardship. That mattered to me more than any courtroom win. Because the truth is, the lesson wasn't just that greed backfires, though it does. It wasn't just that bullies eventually meet a wall, though sometimes they do. It was this: people can steal peace faster than they can steal land. That's the real trick. They exhaust you, confuse you, humiliate you in public, and hope you surrender before the facts catch up. If you hold the line, if you document, if you stay calm long enough to let truth breathe, sometimes the whole rotten structure collapses under its own weight. The next fall, we opened for the biggest pick-your-own weekend in Orchard history. Bluegrass band food trucks, families everywhere, cider pouring in the barn, kids running the rows with sticky hands and red cheeks, Waverly at the entrance table grinning like she'd been waiting 2 years for that exact Saturday. Dolph came by, paid at the gate like everybody else, bit into an apple and said, "Good crop this year." I told him it was the best in a while. And standing there in the October light looking over rows my grandfather planted, rows she tried to turn into a feedlot, I realized something that felt bigger than winning. The orchard had outlived the paperwork. The trees were still doing what trees do, growing, quietly, stubbornly, without asking permission from the wrong people. So here's what I want to know. When somebody uses a title, a rule book, or a little borrowed authority to try to take what isn't theirs, where's the line between justice and payback? And if you've ever had to stand your ground against somebody absolutely certain you'd fold, tell me what happened. Because stories like this aren't really about apples or lawsuits. They're about what people do when power goes rotten and what it takes to make it answer for itself.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video. Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.